In 1942, Australia and the United States were allies. They shared a war, they shared a base, they shared a city. The only thing they didn't share was everything else. I spent weeks going through declassified Australian and American archives, military police records, and documents from the Curtin government to bring you this documentary. What you're about to hear was suppressed by MacArthur immediately after it happened. No Australian newspaper was allowed to publish it. The files remained classified for decades. And one Australian was left dead on a Brisbane street without anyone being able to say his name out loud. In July 1942, Douglas MacArthur moved his headquarters to Brisbane. He set up in the AMP building on Queen Street, in the centre of the city, 4 floors above the daily life of a city that was about to become the largest Allied military hub in the South Pacific. And with MacArthur came the Americans. 80,000 American soldiers. In a city of 330,000 people. Think about that for a moment. For every 4 Brisbane residents, there was 1 American soldier in the pubs, in the restaurants, in the streets, in the leisure spaces that Australians had used their whole lives. Brisbane was an Allied city, yes, but emotionally it was saturated, competitive, and ready to blow. The problem wasn't the war. The problem was what Australians saw every morning when they stepped outside. The Americans had better uniforms, more money to spend, access to cigarettes, chocolates, and goods that for most Australians in wartime were unaffordable luxuries. An American private earned roughly twice what an Australian soldier of equivalent rank earned. Not a little more. Twice. That wasn't a rumour circulating in the pubs. It was a reality visible in every daily interaction between the two armies. The American could buy, the Australian watched. And on top of the pay gap, there was something harder to quantify but just as real. American uniforms were visually superior. Newer, better made, more attractive. The average Australian soldier, with his uniform worn down by months of campaign and his pay at less than half the American rate, saw himself reflected in that contrast every time he crossed paths with an American on the street. And that contrast had a name that circulated in every Brisbane pub. Overpaid, oversexed. Over here? But the money was just the beginning. The Americans had easier access to goods that were scarce for everyone in wartime, more capacity to move around the city, a massive institutional presence backed by MacArthur's headquarters on Queen Street. And then there was something that Australians would remember for decades, with a specific kind of anger. Some Brisbane pubs closed earlier for Australians, but stayed open for American personnel. The American military police patrolled Brisbane with an authority that the locals deeply resented, not necessarily because they were violent, but because their presence on the streets of an Australian city was the most visible symbol of something many Australians felt but couldn't fully articulate, that their own city had stopped being completely theirs. The military police numbers told the story better than any official report. In June 1942, American MPs recorded 140 arrests in Brisbane. In October, 1,100. In South Brisbane, they were breaking up an average of 20 fights per night. 20 fights per night for months. And all of that before the 26th of November. When Douglas MacArthur arrived in Australia in March 1942, he was welcomed as a hero. And he was, in a certain sense. He represented the alliance with the United States. He represented the certainty that Australia wasn't alone against Japan. He represented the possibility that the war could be won. The Australian government gave him command of Australian forces. But over time, that initial admiration started mixing with something more uncomfortable. MacArthur accumulated a power in Australia that no foreigner had ever held before. He commanded Australian forces from an office in Brisbane. He made decisions about Australian lives from a distance that the men at the front measured in kilometres and in lives. And the Australians who watched him operate up close were developing an opinion that no press release captured. MacArthur was necessary. But MacArthur was also the embodiment of an ally that was too powerful and too self-assured operating on Australian soil. For the soldiers on the street, the ones earning half what the Americans earned, the ones drinking in pubs that closed earlier for them, the ones watching American military police enforcing discipline in their own city, MacArthur wasn't a hero. He was the boss of the men who had taken Brisbane from them. By November 1942, Brisbane had been functioning as a pressure cooker for months. 140 arrests in June, 1,100 in October, 20 fights per night in South Brisbane, pubs discriminating against Australians in their own city, a foreign military police force patrolling the streets, an American general commanding the Australian Army from an office on Queen Street. And on top of all that, the racial tensions within the American Army itself that Australians watched without fully understanding black American soldiers finding in Brisbane a more open society than the one they had left in the United States, and white American soldiers responding to that with a violence that added another layer of chaos to a city that already had too many layers. Brisbane was allied. But Brisbane was also a reservoir of human pressure that had been building for months without a release valve. On the 26th of November 1942, that pressure found its spark. In a building in the city centre, in an argument that started over something so small that no official report recorded it with any precision. And that ended with one Australian dead on the street. And with the American command demanding the court-martial of an entire group of Australian soldiers, the 26th of November 1942, Thanksgiving Day for the Americans. 6:50 in the evening. An American soldier named James Stein walked out of a hotel in central Brisbane, drunk, without a valid leave pass. An American military policeman confronted him on the street, asked for the pass. Stein didn't have one. What happened in the next few seconds wasn't in anyone's plan. It wasn't premeditated, it wasn't organised. It was exactly the kind of small, random spark that only produces an explosion when it falls on months of accumulated pressure. Stein resisted. The MPs tried to arrest him. And the Australian soldiers who were on the street, who had spent months watching American military police impose their authority in their own city, who were earning half what the Americans earned, who were drinking in pubs that closed earlier for them, made an instant and collective decision. They took Stein's side. Not because they knew James Stein, but because James Stein was irrelevant. What mattered was what the American MP standing in front of them represented. And within minutes, the street had a crowd. The crowd moved toward the Post Exchange. The PX, the American military store on the corner of Creek and Adelaide Street, was the most visible symbol of everything Australians resented. The place where Americans spent their double pay on goods that Australians couldn't afford. The place where the difference between the two armies was most concrete and most humiliating. 7 o'clock. The Australian crowd besieged the building, bottles against the windows, shouting. The MPs inside barricaded behind the counters. Outside, the crowd kept growing. It wasn't a fight between two men. It was something older and deeper than any individual incident. It was months of resentment finally finding a concrete target. And then someone arrived who shouldn't have been there. American soldier Norbert Grant was off duty that night. It wasn't his shift. He had no orders to be there. But when he heard the noise and saw what was happening, he made the decision that would define the rest of the night. He arrived at the PX with a shotgun. 7:45. In the chaos outside the building, someone tried to take Grant's weapon. The shotgun went off. Australian soldier Edward Webster took the shot in the chest. He died shortly after. Not at the front, not in Papua New Guinea, not in the Middle East. On a Brisbane street, 50 metres from Douglas MacArthur's headquarters. Webster's death didn't calm the situation. It ignited it. Through the following hours, the American MPs fired to defend themselves from inside the PX and the nearby Red Cross Club. 9 MPs seriously wounded on the first night, dozens of Australians injured. At least 9 Australians and 11 Americans hit by gunfire or other means. The Australian officers, the few local MPs present, without enough ammunition, stayed on the sidelines. Not out of cowardice, but because any active intervention on their part in either direction would have escalated what was already a situation at the limit. The 27th of November. The violence hadn't ended. A new crowd, this time of more than 2,000 people, formed in the centre of Brisbane. The ground floor of the PX was demolished. Not damaged, demolished. By a crowd of 2,000 people who had spent the night processing Edward Webster's death and had arrived at the conclusion that the building had to disappear. American MPs confiscated grenades from some members of the crowd. Grenades. Australian soldiers had arrived in central Brisbane with grenades. The violence continued until 10 o'clock on the night of the 27th. When it finally calmed, Police Commissioner Carroll gathered officers from both sides to assess the damage, and then made a decision that would define how this story would be remembered, or more precisely, how it would not be remembered for the decades that followed. He censored the press. No Australian newspaper published what had happened. 1 Australian dead, hundreds injured, the PX demolished, 2 nights of violence in central Brisbane, and absolute silence in the media. When the sun came up over Brisbane on the 27th of November, the American command had a clear position on what needed to happen to the Australian soldiers involved in the disturbances. Mass court-martial. Not an individual process, not an investigation. A collective court-martial of the Australian soldiers implicated in the attacks on the PX and the Red Cross Club. The American logic was simple. Their installations had been attacked. Their MPs had been assaulted. A man had fired his weapon and another man had died. Military order required formal consequences. And those consequences, in the American view, needed to be processed through the American military justice system. There was a fundamental problem with that proposal. The Australian soldiers were Australian, on Australian soil, and the Australian officers had a very clear opinion about whether they were going to hand their men over to a foreign court-martial in their own country. There is no exact documented verbatim quote of what the Australian officers said to the American command in the hours that followed the disturbances. But their position didn't need quotes to be completely clear. No. The local Australian MPs and junior officers refused to cooperate actively during the incident. They refused to hand their men over to the American command for mass trials. 1 Australian officer intervened directly to persuade the American MP commander to withdraw his troops and avoid an escalation that, at that point, could have been much worse than it already was. It wasn't insubordination. It was a line that the Australian officers drew with the clarity of men who understood exactly what was at stake. Australian soldiers would not be tried by a foreign court-martial on Australian soil. The final result was a compromise that didn't fully satisfy anyone. 5 Australians were processed for assault through the Australian system. 1 received a 6-month sentence. The mass court-martial that the American command had proposed did not happen. And American soldier Norbert Grant, the man whose shotgun had killed Edward Webster, was acquitted. Justifiable homicide in self-defense. 1 Australian dead. The man who killed him acquitted. 5 Australians processed for assaulting the MPs who had provoked the disturbances. The Australian officers who knew the full details of the case stayed quiet, because quiet was what the alliance required. Douglas MacArthur wasn't in Brisbane on the night of the 26th of November. His headquarters, the AMP building on Queen Street, meters from the demolished PX, had been verbally attacked by the crowd. His installations had been the epicenter of 2 nights of violence. And when MacArthur assessed the situation, he made the decisions that any commander in his position would have made to ensure it didn't happen again. Relocation of American units to reduce friction with Australians, increase in the number of MPs in conflict zones, closure of Australian canteens in certain areas, transfer of the American PX to a less visible location. Practical changes. Changes that implicitly acknowledged that something had failed in the management of cohabitation between the 2 armies, but without any public acknowledgement of what had actually happened. Because the Chief Censor's Office had issued an order in the hours immediately following the incident that defined exactly how it would be remembered, or more precisely, how it would not be remembered, the text of the order is one of the most revealing documents in the entire history. No cabling or broadcasting of details of tonight's Brisbane servicemen's riot. Background for censors only. 1 Australian killed, 6 wounded. The Brisbane Courier-Mail published a version so censored it was practically unrecognisable. No nationalities, no causes, no Edward Webster, no Norbert Grant, no demolished PX, no 2 nights of violence that had paralysed the city centre. In the United States, the incident was never reported. The mail of the American soldiers involved was censored so their families wouldn't know what had happened. But the silence of the media didn't mean real silence. It meant rumours. And the rumours that circulated in Brisbane in the days and weeks following the incident were considerably more dramatic than the already dramatic reality. 15 Australians machine-gunned by American MPs. That was the most widespread rumour. 15. Not 1, not 6. 15 Australians killed by American military police on the streets of Brisbane. It was false. But it circulated for years, as if it were true. Because when the truth is censored, the space it leaves gets filled by more extreme versions of itself. Here's what the Battle of Brisbane didn't do. It didn't break the alliance. 2 weeks after the PX ground floor was demolished by a crowd of 2,000 people, Australians and Americans were still fighting together in New Guinea, still sharing intelligence, still dying in the same Boonagona swamps against the same Japanese bunkers. The alliance MacArthur commanded from Queen Street didn't fracture because of what had happened on the street in front of his headquarters. Because it couldn't fracture. Japan was still advancing. Australia still needed the United States. And the United States still needed Australia. The resentment didn't disappear with the censorship. It stayed. For years after the war, anti-Americanism in Australia had a specific texture that historians trace directly to the 1942 experience. The overpaid, oversexed, over here wasn't just a clever phrase. It was the synthesis of something a generation of Australians had felt in their own city and had never been able to express publicly because the media hadn't published it. Divorce rates in Australia increased in the years following the war. Marriages between Australian women and American soldiers, the war brides left a social wound that in some communities lasted decades. Not because the war was bad for the alliance, but because the forced cohabitation of 2 armies with radically different salaries in the same city had produced exactly the kind of friction that no military plan had anticipated, and the American racial segregation that black American soldiers had brought with them to Australia, and the violence with which some white American soldiers maintained it on Australian soil, left Australians with a more complicated image of their ally than any official communique ever acknowledged. The Battle of Brisbane remained a public secret for decades. Not formally classified, simply not spoken about, not published, not taught. An entire generation of Australians grew up not knowing that in November 1942, an Australian had died on the streets of Brisbane at the hands of an American MP. Not knowing that a crowd of 2,000 had demolished the PX. Not knowing that the American command had proposed a mass court-martial that the Australian officers had rejected. In 1981, a book called Oversexed, Overpaid and Over Here started breaking that silence. Through the 80s and 90s, the Australian archives began to open. Historians started finding the Chief Censor's order, veterans' testimonies, military police records. There is no single declassification date because there was never a formal classification. There was only silence. And the silence eroded decades later, when the men who had been in Brisbane that night started dying, and their families started telling what they had never been able to tell. MacArthur maintained command of Australian forces until 1945. Operational cooperation between the 2 armies continued. The campaigns in New Guinea, the Philippines, Borneo, All were executed with the same command structure that existed on the night of the 26th of November 1942. What changed was more subtle. More MPs in friction zones. Units relocated to reduce contact between the two armies during leisure time. Australian canteens closed in certain areas. The PX moved to a less visible location. Small changes. Changes that implicitly acknowledged something had failed without anyone in a position of authority saying so out loud. And post-war, the Australian-American alliance was formalised in the Anzac Treaty of 1951. The same alliance that had survived 2 nights of violence in Brisbane. The same alliance that Curtin had protected by censoring the press. The same alliance that MacArthur had kept alive by publicly ignoring what had happened in front of his own headquarters. Anzac didn't happen despite Brisbane. It happened in part because of the decision that Brisbane couldn't be allowed to destroy it. Today, the Battle of Brisbane appears in Australian museums, in Anzac Square in Brisbane, in documentaries that tell the story the 1,942 newspapers weren't allowed to publish. Edward Webster has a name in the records. Norbert Grant has a verdict in the archives. The 5 Australians prosecuted have files that historians can read. And on the corner of Creek and Adelaide Street in Brisbane, where the PX ground floor was demolished by 2,000 Australians in November 1942, there is now a building that no sign identifies with what happened there. The story that couldn't be published in 1942 has no plaque in 2024 either, but it exists in the archives. And in the memory of a generation that lived it and never spoke about it because the chief censor told them they couldn't. There's something about this story that the declassified files don't fully capture. Not the number of wounded, not the censorship order, not the court-martial that never happened. It's this. An Australian officer told the American command that he was not going to hand his soldiers over to a foreign court-martial on Australian soil. No documented verbatim quote, no name in the historical records. Just a position that the archives describe with the clarity of something that doesn't need words. No. 1 Australian dead. The man who killed him acquitted. The story censored for decades. And the alliance that all of it threatened to destroy survived because 2 governments decided that Japan was a more important enemy than the resentment that had accumulated on the streets of Brisbane. They were right. But Edward Webster was still dead. There's another story just as buried as this one. A conflict between allies that also didn't appear in the newspapers of the time, in a different theatre, with consequences that changed the way 2 armies fought together forever. It's in the next video.